My name's James Bennet. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and we have a great panel gathered this morning to talk about the rise of the sharing economy, or the gig economy, or the peer economy, terms that I hope we'll define as we go forward. But it's the astonishing transformation we're all witnessing as increasing number of people around the world turn to renting space in their homes, or providing each other rides or meals, or performing odd jobs for each other through all these new platforms that are coming into being. We have a great group gathered to talk about it. To my immediate left is Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, a company famously founded with his partner 6 years ago with a couple of air mattresses in an apartment in San Francisco. Is valued when they sought their latest round of investment at $10 billion. And through the platform, I think it now hosts, 400,000, is that the correct?
425,000 people a night.
425,000 people a night worldwide. To Brian's left is David Sheard, who is the council leader of the Kirklees Council, which, as Mayor Bloomberg just said, is one of the winners this year of the Bloomberg Philanthropies Mayor's, Mayor's Challenge for its plan on municipal sharing. Kirklees, I think, is named for the legendary burial site, right, of Robin Hood?
Correct.
An early advocate of a different form of sharing. And we'll get to the example of Kirklees later in the conversation. To his left is Arun Sundararajan, who is a professor of information, operations, and management sciences at NYU. He has a background in electrical engineering and has also dabbled as an entrepreneur himself. Among other flattering things, he's been called is the first public intellectual of the age of the sharing economy. April Rinne is an expert on sharing who advises a range of companies and governments on the subject. In addition, she leads the Sharing Economy Working Group of the World Economic Forum, and she sits on the Sharing Economy Advisory Board of Seoul, South Korea, which is another example I hope will surface as the conversation goes forward. I hope it will be a conversation. I'm going to ask maybe the first 30 minutes or so worth of questions, and then I'd like to open it up to you guys to hopefully take a couple questions from the audience. And I'd like to start, Brian, with you, with a question of the social transformation we're seeing, but I actually would like to start first with a question which I think is probably on everybody's mind, which is, where did you sleep last night?
I stayed in Los Feliz in a house with a wonderful woman. She's been hosting for just a month, and I had a great experience last night. I'm by myself, just to clarify.
All right, what in your view is driving this shift beyond the technology that's enabling it? Why it was arguably the post-war American life, the entire economy was founded on the idea that every man's home is his castle. Our entire highway system was built on that principle, as well as the American suburb. That idea seems, if not being thrown out the window, to being subverted by what's going on right now. So what explains this shift?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things that have happened. I think at our core, the thing that we invented wasn't the ability to book someone's home. I think what we invented was a very streamlined mechanism for trust. It used to be, before us, essentially everyone ostensibly was a stranger. And the moment that everyone got an identity and you could transact with them, it really meant that, before that, the only things you could buy were from companies, because you could trust those companies, because those companies had brands, and those brands said, we can be trusted. But a person, you couldn't trust. You wouldn't trust a hitchhiker. You wouldn't trust an ordinary person in the street. The moment identity got attached to people, suddenly the playing field was leveled. And all of a sudden, you used to live in a world where you had people and you had businesses. And one day, with identity, people could act as businesses. They could act as micro-entrepreneurs. And I think this has been a pretty profound shift. And I think what it really means for cities and for all of us is that the revolution that happened with the internet was a digital revolution primarily. And it affected information, it affected communication. And eventually, with things like what we're doing and with Lyft and Uber and other companies, it means that is moving into neighborhoods. It's moving onto streets. It's moving into people's homes.
Would one of the, Arun, maybe you, to what extent, though, is it simply economic need that's driving this? And with these new forms of work, are they substituting for other long-established, Uber substituting for driving a taxi, for example, Airbnb substituting for other sorts of service industry jobs? We're making more efficient use of existing products rather than creating new products. And what is the impact of that on economic growth in cities?
Well, I mean, I think that the economic downturn may have been a catalyst, but it's certainly not the fundamental force that's driving the emergence of the sharing economy. I mean, the digital trust infrastructure that Brian pointed to is certainly a part of it. I think our comfort with technology, the way in which we are we've gotten used to getting stuff from the other side of the internet rather than just information through peer-to-peer file sharing networks and sort of a growing level of comfort with online retailing. So the time was right a few years ago for us to sort of take online services that sort of involved peers interacting with other peers. I think that there are a number of sort of broader economic changes that sort of accompany the rise of the sharing economy. I mean, we're moving from an economy where we primarily bought stuff or received services from institutions to one in which platforms are mediating transactions between peers and other peers, the Airbnb host selling to the guest, the Lyft driver driving the passenger. And this is a pretty profound shift. I don't think that it's, let me put it this way, that when we do this, sure, we're using our assets more efficiently, but it's not just taking an existing asset and having a few other people use it. We're creating new products and services. I mean, if you contrast the range of options available on Airbnb with the range of options that existed before it, variety has increased. And when you increase variety and you lower transaction costs and you grow productivity, the productivity with which you use your labor or use your assets, in the long run, this generally signals economic growth. So I'm very optimistic.
But what do we actually know? April, maybe you could take this, or Arun. What do we actually know about the cities where this new economy has really taken off? What impact it's had on civic life generally, but specifically on the city economy?
Go ahead.
I'm happy to take that. And it's a great question. And I would say right now, we're still by and large in a learning phase. And cities are taking very different approaches to this space as a whole. And here, I'm looking across verticals and across levels of economic development. And I'm particularly intrigued and encouraged, interested in those places also where there is some kind of economic stress, where this can be a tool not just of economic recovery, but also bringing people back into relationship with one another. And I think we have in the audience today some cities that are well known for their experimentation and innovation and leadership in the sharing economy. I think Seoul, South Korea is one. Mayor Park has a sharing city initiative that includes not just engagement with the private sector, but they too have passed legislation that's supportive, big picture of this space. They've committed investment funds, but they're also really trying to reconnect community. And I think that's one of the big insights I have, where it is oftentimes on day one, economics, either the ability to earn some income or save money, or both. That does drive a lot of people on day one, but when you ask that same cohort of people, why do you stay involved? Why do you get more involved over time? The number one answer usually is it's the people I meet. It's the community I connect with. It's not necessarily that economics disappears, but it recedes in overall significance. And I think that Seoul also understood that very early on. And what they're trying to do, among other things, is really recreate that sense of neighborhood. And in addition to helping startups and so forth, they're also doing things around community hubs, community-based sharing. Some of it is monetized, but a lot of it is also how can we create value where money necessarily doesn't exchange hands.
Arun, did you want to address this?
Yeah, and just to sort of build on a couple of points that April raised, that this is actually a phenomenon that a city should embrace as something that will grow its economy. For example, if you look at wage rates on TaskRabbit or Handybook, the labor markets that are connecting sort of professionals or service providers with customers, on average, what I seem to have noticed is that the wage rates that people are charging are significantly higher than the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, averages for that particular region. And so there's sort of some early evidence that perhaps this will actually sort of grow wage rates.
And that's to do TaskRabbit, for example. What sorts of things are people offering to do?
Well, it's not the stuff that you'd read about in the press, of not sort of standing in line at the DMV for someone else. These are like plumbers, electricians, copywriters, things that where you actually have to be physically present, until robot technology sort of really takes off. Your plumber is likely to have to sort of live in the same city as you. And so these kinds of things don't seem to have the kinds of wage effects that, say, Odesk or Elance or labor marketplaces for information services had. And the other point that I wanted to build on of April's is that, the fact that we've got digital technologies connecting people with each other as part of everyday economic activity, that to me is truly profound, because if you look at the last 150 years of writing about technological progress, a theme that emerges is that technology progresses and people get disconnected from their communities. They get disconnected from each other. They're sort of tethered to each other through these online networks without actually forming real emotive relationships. So when I look at not just the sharing economy, but platforms like Meetup, and I start to see people getting connected with other people and actually having real human interaction in economic activities that used to be sort of individual, isolated, and faceless, this is really encouraging, because it's sort of a tremendous need for a society. Cities often tend to be the loneliest places, despite being the most densely populated, and so that's sort of we haven't explored in great detail yet with the data, the extent to which the sharing economy is, but the casual evidence, the sort of anecdotal evidence is sort of very strongly supports the fact that, as we integrate more and more of these kinds of peer-to-peer activities and casual sort of rather than a professional, as we blur the lines between personal and professional, this effect is going to be a lot stronger.
And I think just one follow-up on Arun, if we want to look at what the world will look like with the sharing economy in the 21st century, then we can, instead of looking to the future, maybe just look to the past. And if you look to the past, maybe prior to World War II, there was a much greater sense of community. We were much closer. People were more entrepreneurial. And I think this is emerging again. So I think in many ways, as Arun says, we're living closer together yet, and sometimes in cities more isolated and further apart than ever before. I used to live here in Los Angeles before I started Airbnb, and I used to remember driving for an hour each way on the 405 by myself in this kind of bubble of a car with all these other isolated people, and I kind of imagined, I can't imagine this is the way the city was designed to be. And of course it wasn't always that way. And now I think it's a matter of people being able to take this economy back into their own hands, bring each other together, and I think what it really means, the cities are becoming a little more like villages again. It's not a profound change in many ways, it's just kind of bringing us a little bit closer to the sense of community that we have.
So you're suggesting the anomalous period might seem to be the 50 years after World War II rather than what we're going through now?
I think the post-World War II was a period where we were first globalized. People were generally considered strangers because the idea of an intimate community, all the communities got kind of bucketed together. We were first living in cities for the first time in a major way. And yeah, I think it was a period of isolation and a little bit of a period of mass production. And I think now you're starting to see we're yearning for things that are handmade. We're yearning for things that are local. People, if they have a choice, won't necessarily want to eat mass-produced food. I think they're going to continue to want things that are created by people, not just machines.
Can I bring, David, you into the conversation here with a concrete example of Kirklees? Why, I guess it's the why and the how of what Kirklees is doing to embrace the sharing economy. Why did you decide to do it, and what specifically are you doing?
I think there's a recognised disconnect between politics and people. Politics means other people, but there's a disconnect. We have open cabinet meetings. And at the cabinet meeting just recently, we were discussing the closing of the sports centre. And a member of the public came along and said that you can't close that sports centre because you don't own it. The public own it. Now that demonstrated some lack of understanding of the democratic process, but it also raised a question that people believe that they own the facilities and that we think we own. We have concentrated, and when we try to make it simple, we talk about space, stuff and skills, which are buildings, people and assets. That we own, and at the moment we own those assets to deliver services to the people. We want to change that round so that those assets, along with assets of private sector and voluntary bodies and other public sector, are used to help the public deliver services to themselves. So we deliver services with the public rather than for the public. Because it's that disconnect that you've talked about all the things in society where people used to meet. In the UK, there's less people going to church, they don't go to local pubs, they don't meet at school, they don't work together, they don't go to the local shops together. Everything is isolated and in boxes. And I think that there is a yearning for that together. And we face we've all got economic problems. We face a problem that if we don't do something now, our care bill means by the year 2020, 2021, we will have no money left for anything else but keeping people in care. So we have got to try a way to have less people in care. And we see having less people in care is building those communities up, building a need. So we're trying to put together the people who have retired particularly into saying that, look, there's life after retirement. You can serve the community. But we're not saying that you will do that. We're trying to create a model that allows people to have their own ideas. And what we're trying to do is make those ideas public so that they can be, where they are successful, they are replicated. And where they fail, we can be avoided. We're trying to create a situation where someone could have an idea, whatever that is, but that idea and the development is shared across our city and across other cities. So that we can, and it's driven from below rather than above. We are not saying what you have to do. We are saying, what do you want to do? What is stopping you doing that? What resources do we have that we can help you deliver that? And that's what we're trying to create. And now with the social media and the technology, we've got that technology to share that. These things have been happening for 20, 30 years. People have formed different organisations to deliver something locally. It hasn't been replicated across the city. It hasn't been replicated across the country. So what we're trying to do is demonstrate that, yes, this is what happened. These are the problems. If we can solve those problems and tell someone we've solved those problems so they can solve them somewhere else, we can then start growing those things that you said that we've lost, where people will get together, we'll keep them active longer, we'll stop them becoming inactive and requiring city care.
So you're describing in a way that government stepping back from providing direct services to people and becoming more of an enabler of this new person-to-person approach to providing services.
I personally believe that's the way that we've got to go forward. I think that there is no doubt there is a disconnect within the UK, the disconnect between politicians and the public. The public tend to use politicians as a term of abuse. Yeah.
We don't have that problem here.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. And in a way, we deserve it in some ways, but we've got to try something that works differently. We've got to try people to say that yes, they are part of the citizenship. They've got responsibilities as well as requirements.
Arun, you wanted to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, what I hear David saying is that we're taking these familiar activities, these community activities, and in some sense we're scaling them with the markets that are being created by digital technology and by, for lack of a better word, the engine of capitalism. Because I see the sharing economy as being, at its roots, while rooted in a desire for efficiency and for community. I mean, some of the fundamentals are sort of familiar capitalism, and I say this as a good thing, because capitalism is something that can sort of scale these desirable behaviors. And so, as we sort of look forward and look at this division between, what the government should be doing and what we should delegate to the platforms or what we should delegate to the market, I sort of see the government taking on a role, at least sort of in sort of free market capitalist economies, that it always has taken on, which is that it doesn't step in and say, I'm going to do the stuff that the market can do better. it steps back and says, well, let the market sort of run its course. And then when something goes wrong, when there's an intervention needed, when there's sort of like, wheelchair accessible taxis needed, when there's better fire safety needed, when there's disaster preparedness needed, I'll step in and I'll sort of correct it. And so, this partnership between the marketplace and the government is sort of what underlies most of our free market capitalist societies. And we're just sort of seeing a new iteration of it because technologies have made these marketplaces that are scaling these community behaviors so much more efficient so that they can do a lot more. That you needed a taxi regulator 20 years ago because there was no other collective sitting between the passenger and the taxi. Now there is, and so we want to delegate.
In the form of a rating system?
A rating system, but it's more like an institution, right? I mean, you've got Uber and Lyft, which are sort of like, platforms that go well beyond rating systems, where we might ask them to sort of shoulder some of the responsibility that society typically had asked the government to shoulder. And a lot of these platforms are going to say, and like Brian can speak to what Airbnb does, but they're going to say, yeah, of course we're going to do it because it's smart capitalism. We want a safe consumer experience. We want sort of a healthy and happy and sort of well-protected workforce. And so we're going to step in and do a lot of this stuff ourselves because it makes sense.
April?
Yeah, building a bit on what Arun said and also what David said, I want to point out the example of Kirklees as really a great example when we talk about the sharing economy also. It's looking at two-sided markets where both sides we now can access, can exchange both supply and demand, needs and haves, whatever we want to call it, in a peer-based mechanism. And in Kirklees, that's exactly what you're doing. You're trying to identify what are the assets that we already have in the community that we can share, broadly speaking, with one another. Some of that may replace things that used to cost the government money before. Other things may simply be bringing people back into relationship and creating social value, immense social value that helps build a more resilient economy. But this is the kind of thing, if you have economic stress, it's a great thing. You may need to do this. But even when you don't, even in times of prosperity, this is something, one of the things I like best is it just makes common sense. We want to build social capital. We want to build greater relationships, greater connectedness, and I don't like to use the phrase to do more with less because that sort of sounds like we're shortchanging something. But if we actually can utilize all kinds of assets more efficiently, even better. And then if I zoom out just briefly, and maybe we can turn back to this in a little bit, but when I zoom out and look at, taking the example of Kirklees, but at a much broader level, and perhaps some of the things that Kirklees might be able to share with other cities down the road, but even with or without that, how do we shift a little bit of the dialogue and instead of looking at, oh my goodness, what do we do about this space, think about how the sharing economy as a whole can really help a city. What would it mean to, in effect, place a city at the center of a conversation like this and think about different kinds of public services, think about the need for urban transportation, think about the need for, how do we bring more people and more opportunity into cities without just clogging our buildings and our streets with more stuff. I mean, all of this, there are so many benefits from an urban planning perspective of what's going on. I hope that we can start shifting the dialogue, whether it's today or in the future, also towards how to be not just proactive, but an active beneficiary and participant in the process.
Because in a sense, I guess, sort of cities are the original sharing economies, right? I mean, a city is a platform that was designed sort of in an old analog way for sharing resources because people were living in a densely populated area. We've got new digital technologies that are making sharing efficient in new ways. And so it's just a question of sort of saying, how do we sort of integrate this into the way the city functions, right? Rather than thinking of it as something that's entering from the outside.
And there's a few things, there's a few things that we potentially can do to partner with cities. So two examples for us. The first example is in New York. 2 years ago, Hurricane Sandy hit New York City, and a woman named Shell, she's a host in Brooklyn, she decided she wanted to open her home for free. At the time, we didn't have a system to actually rent your place for nothing. And so we had to hack our system together, and eventually 1,400 hosts in New York City eventually opened their homes in New York City. What this led for us was a disaster relief program that we've rolled out to 34,000 cities all over the world, whereas within 30 minutes, if there's a disaster, we can activate our community, they can open their homes. Now this works best if we proactively partner their city ahead of time, so in the event of a disaster, they know to recommend us, and we know how to place the people that are displaced into the homes. So that was the first example, and this is something that I think it would have been hard for the city to do completely on their own, but in a great partnership, we can leverage our great advantages with theirs. And the second was in Brazil for the World Cup. This World Cup, this summer, 600,000 people came to Brazil for the World Cup, and it was one of the biggest World Cups ever. 600,000 people came. 120,000 of those people, 1 in 5 people, were staying in an Airbnb. So the Minister of Tourism had reached out to us ahead of time saying, we need help. We don't have enough hotels, we can't house this event and fill the capacity for every single person that wants to be able to come. And really just by helping, working, and promoting us, we were able to, I think, expand 20% the size of this event.
So, and I'm going to open it up to you guys after this last question, which I offer to any one of you who wants to take this on. You got a room full of mayors, city planners, others here. What are the hazards here that they should, if any, that they should be worried about as they think about this sharing economy gradually taking more and more purchase on city life? What should they be guarding against and thinking about, or is it just really a question of kind of staying out of the way and finding ways to enable it?
Well, I'll go. I certainly don't think that cities should stay out of the way completely. I think that perhaps the number one hazard is not understanding what's going on. I think it was Brian who said a few months ago that in order to understand something, in order to regulate something, you first need to understand it. And this may seem really simple, but I think that there's perhaps a lot of fear instigated in part by incumbents whose livelihood is being threatened by a new model and who are going to have to sort of transition to making a living the new way. And so, I think the 2 or 3 things that a city should be looking out for is first sort of understanding exactly what's going on, understanding the opportunity here. Another thing that they should be thinking about is creating a transition plan for people who might be displaced by new economic activity brought in by the sharing economy. And so if there are 10,000 Uber cars and a few thousand Lyft cars in New York now, and that places some pressure on the people who are driving the yellow cabs who have paid millions of dollars for their medallions. The city should be thinking about, well, how do we sort of transition? If I look forward 10 years, a vast majority of point-to-point urban transportation is going to be platform mediated. How do I get these people who are doing things the old way and sort of come up with a path for them to be able to sort of adopt the new technology? And I guess the final thing that I'd have cities thinking about is, and this builds on something that Brian brought up about the World Cup, is to think about this as invisible infrastructure. I mean, if you think about 120,000 people staying in Airbnbs for the World Cup, that's 120,000 less hotel rooms that were constructed because this infrastructure was created invisibly. You add up the number of people that carpooling and BlaBlaCar, the 2 sort of big city-to-city ride-sharing platforms in Europe, are carrying, and it rivals the number of people that Amtrak carries in the United States every day. And so we're sort of creating, based on these highways that have already been built, invisible infrastructure without having to sort of spend on steel and concrete.
One of the fears I've got that is people are frightened to share, are frightened of failure, and they're frightened of sharing that failure. So I think what is important is not just sharing our successes across all the city, all the city, is also being open to share where we've gone wrong, and not be frightened of doing something because we fear of the repercussions of that failure. Yeah. And that is a big motivation for officers and employees of councils and cities.
Yeah.
The employees think, I don't want to deal with that person because it might go wrong, when it's quite safe for me just to deliver what I want to deliver. Whereas they wanted to do something different that might go wrong, that might reflect on me. Now, what I see, what we see as our platform doing is what we're wanting our platform to do is to start from when an idea is formed, to share that progress of that idea, to show where the problems are, and to show where it's gone wrong. And we also want to know where things have gone wrong in other cities, so we don't replicate their failures.
Absolutely.
But I think we've got. It's not just sharing assets. I think it's much more about sharing ideas and sharing vision. And I think that's what we've got to try and drive. All cities have got that response. We're all much in the same boat. Some are a bit better off than others, and some are damn sight worse off than others. But we've all got to start building something different and embracing the new, but sharing that experience of it with others to show where the problems are. So we don't all. So we learn from others' mistakes, but we also have got to allow others to learn from our mistakes. We don't need to hide our failures. We need to publicise our failures so that others can learn by it. And that's extremely difficult to say, yes, we got this wrong.
And one of the things that I guess the most important thing I would want people, regulators in cities to know is that, I came here, and I think I speak for most of the people running most of the platforms, that we actually want to work together. That we don't want to succeed in spite of a city. In fact, I think it's impossible for us to succeed in spite of a city. Because our business model is we take a 13% cut. That means that 87% of the economic activity is this activity the city is getting. The city thrives, we thrive. We can't thrive in spite of a city. And we're in 34,000 cities. We can't work with every city, but we'd love to be able to work with many of the cities here. And we have partnerships with dozens of cities all over the world. I don't think for anybody in the sharing economy to win, it means other people have to lose. I think this is primarily additive. I also don't think everything about this system is perfect. If you create a new infrastructure overnight, there's going to be unforeseen consequences. There are going to be things we never thought of. And every day, we meet with mayors of cities, and they say, well, what about this? And then we work through it with them. I don't think anything is insurmountable. We ultimately, at the end of the day, I want cities to want us. I want cities to want all of these platforms. And I want to hope that if we were around, a city could say, and the citizens of that city could say, that because of these new platforms, these technologies, our lives are better and they're more enriched. And if that means us working together, I think that's what's going to have to happen.
Let me open it up here. There are microphones in the room. Let's go right here. Please introduce yourself and ask a question.
Okay, Esther Dyson from Hiccup. So it seems one of the most interesting peer-to-peer things that's arising is actually the regulatory system for whatever it is. And cities, or if you like, legacy systems may have regulatory systems that are too expensive and ossified. The new players may be too small. How do you deal with accountability, with the fact that maybe your customers are racist, that how do you make the regulatory system accountable to both sides?
Yeah, and I think this is a really good question. We don't want to compete with the governments for regulation. I think the way I like to think about it, and Arun had said this really well, is that I think Airbnb and other platforms are great screening mechanisms, great reputation mechanisms, and then the governments could be the place of last recourse. So we hold the communities accountable, and the governments can hold us accountable to what framework they want to have. In every city around the world, things are going to be 90% the same or 80% the same, 20% different. A few basic things. We want to make sure there's accountability and there are no strangers on the platform. I think one of the things the sharing economy suggests is that there is not anonymous activity. When there's not anonymous activity, there is accountability. There's basic levels of insurance. There's basic consumer protections, 24/7 customer support. At the end of the day, you want to make sure that the customers are protected. That's the most important thing. The second thing is you got to make sure that we're in dialogues with the city, so that if there are any bad actors, any people on the seller side that are being unscrupulous, that aren't enriching the city, that we have a mechanism to actually screen them and remove them from the platform. And we have actually had really great partnerships. The UK government today announced that they're going to be revisiting the 40-year-old housing laws and want to revisit how to rewrite the laws in the entire country for this. And we in France, in the beginning of the year, they passed a new law that said that you can now legally rent your home or your second home, in partnership with Airbnb. So this was something that was very much a collaboration.
Yeah, and I think that, go ahead.
Yeah, just building on that as well, I think this really is a call to action for governments. And going back to your earlier question, James, about what are the risks and where do we see this going, I mean, this is a huge opportunity for city governments to not only meet their own needs, but it's a challenging process, but there's still a role that needs to be in part redefined. And we sort of joke quite seriously, that it's not business as we've normally known it. It's not a centralized institution. But at the same time, it's not activity that you're going to leave completely unregulated. When there are issues of public safety, insurance, things that just make sense and that the city or a public sector body has always had a fiduciary duty to look after, what we're doing is really in the process of redefining what does a middle path look like, where it's not an ownership-based business and it's not completely unregulated, but it's something, at the risk of saying it's bespoke or it's customized, it's a third path. And I think what's important to signal, in my experience, to regulators as well is and to David's point, we don't necessarily get everything right on the first try. This is iterative, but the beauty of having some of these tech-based platforms is that you can get much better feedback, and I think it relates to Esther's question as well around who's showing up on these platforms, how are we doing? We're getting a lot of data from the users themselves. Governments, as we figure out how do we set regulations appropriately, what is a real risk and what is a perceived risk? A perceived risk basically because it's something we're not used to yet. As we grow up in this space, how do we help create policy processes that are more nimble and also more iterative so that we're not stuck in this situation of fear of, it's going to be a law in the books, off we go and sort of hope for the best, as opposed to seeing something that actually is evolving over time, which I know it's hard historically for policymakers in that way, but we're starting to collect examples and case studies from cities and towns around the world of how they're able to do that and actually harness.
Just real quick,
bottom up.
I think that's a great question, and I agree with most of what my co-panelists have said. There are certain protections that the government has created for the model of business where institutions are dealing with individuals. We're blurring the lines between personal and professional here, and so there's going to be this middle ground where people feel that certain things are okay because it's sort of personal, but in fact they're unacceptable professionally. And this is something that governments really have to focus on, sort of recreating that protection, that infrastructure of protection that was built for an old economy where a bulk of the transactions were between a corporation that was accountable and an individual, to sort of apply to an economy where we've blurred these lines between personal and professional, and we're going to have to sort of impose certain sort of societally desirable behaviors on these marketplaces as well.
Do we have time? Thanks for just one more question here.
Hi, Ron Finley. How do we make this fair? How do we make this redesigned cities fair, not predatory on certain neighborhoods? Because I go across the United States of America and I see the inner cities, they're being left out. And it's like, if it's a whole city, let's treat it like that. And the way they're redesigning these cities, it's not like that. Okay, if we're gonna be LA, let's be LA, everybody. So everybody should share in that. How do we do that? How do we make the food in these neighborhoods the same as food in other parts of the city? That's what I want. That's what the redesign needs to be, and it's not being attended to.
David, did you?
That might be the new role that we as cities have to take on. It's all right having a sharing economy based on internet access if you've got parts of the city that never will have internet access. Not everyone can access it. We haven't got universal cable, we haven't got universal Wi-Fi. It might be the role of the city to say that we need to redress the balance to the area and the limited resource that we've got need to go into the areas to bring them up to speed with everyone else. So we know that in our area we've got 80% coverage for high-speed broadband in my authority. The other 20% are disadvantaged. Now some areas can get around that because they're affluent enough, others can't. We have got people that can't access education, can't access apprenticeships, haven't got support networks. Particularly I'm thinking about, in our case, in looked after children who don't have the support network of rich parents who can find them a job and make those contacts. and they don't necessarily have access to the technology. They don't have internet access because they can't afford it. So it might be that we have to direct our resources to say it's important that those children that have been looked after haven't got the backup, haven't got that internet access. And it might be the social platform we say is that because we realise that it's not just now, it's when they're 30 years old and 40 years old, they've no family to fall back on. That family might be a family of other people with shared experiences. And if we can connect them somehow electronically and give them the facility to do that, that might provide them the support that they don't get from anywhere else. So I think that's a role that we will never move away from as elected politicians. It's our duty to look after people who can't look after themselves. And that's probably our only function. The people who can look after themselves can get on with it.
Yeah,
Our probably only function is to make sure that people are not left behind.
Absolutely, and to me, one of the greatest opportunities that I was sort of drawn to with the sharing economy was the ability to sort of equalize standards of living without necessarily equalizing income or wealth by having people who have a lot of assets share with people who don't. I've been working with a team of students at NYU over the last few months in trying to create a marketplace design that facilitates the sharing of assets with people with a lot too, and we're going to sort of do a pilot on the Lower East Side later this year. But I think that's a big part of the solution, sort of moving beyond sharing across sort of socioeconomic groups that are homogenous and creating, and they may involve sort of real-world assets and real-world physical presences, and sort of extending the sharing to sort of being across these socioeconomic boundaries.
And I would actually say, the last thing I would say is, I think this is actually starting to happen. So just speaking of New York, where you live, about half of our listings are in Brooklyn. And we have thousands of people every night, and they're staying in Queens, they're staying in the Bronx, they're staying in Staten Island. These are typically not places that tourists would come and they'd stay in when they stay in New York. Typically, they would stay in Midtown Manhattan. 80% of people that now visit New York on Airbnb are staying outside of Midtown Manhattan, outside the hotel district. And the people they're staying with, about half of them live below the median income. So I do think that this is something that is already starting to happen. I think we can continue to do more, but the idea of the sharing economy is access, not just consumer access that I can go anywhere, but participation. That for the first time, maybe in 60 seconds, I too can become an entrepreneur.
This is a great point to end on, I think, because it frames the challenge as well as the opportunity for city governments. Thank you all very much
Thank you.
For participating, and on to the next panel.